Hi, good evening, everyone. Pau here, and this is book number 2 out of the 52 book challenge. I'm gonna read 52 books within a span of a year or 52 weeks. So this is book number 2, and the book that I chose is the book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And I prepared a quick slide to present it, sharing my screen. So the main reason why I chose this book is because whenever I read about human psychology, human behavior, Daniel Kahneman has always been mentioned, and his book, he's well known for the book of this book rather, Thinking Fast and Slow. He's actually the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and there's a lot of key insights, takeaways specific to this book, and really explains on how we think and how we tend to be biased in making decisions. And I think the key takeaway here is um, the ones presented on screen, right? So the core thesis of the book is us human beings, we have two systems or two ways of thinking. We have the system one and we have the system two. So the system one is more of the quick, fast way of making decisions based on previous experience and different mental biases. And system two is more of it requires effort. It requires us to give time, real thought into it in making decisions, right? And there's also a lot of biases or heuristics, as you may call it. But for my understanding or easier terminology, it's more of a mental shortcut. So the affect heuristic, anchoring bias, so on and so forth, which I'll discuss throughout this presentation, right? So let's go first. So basically, the core thesis or the core message of the book is system one and system two. So there's two kinds of thinking, and there's no one way, there's no one system better over the other. But in fact, these two systems work together to make our lives easier and to make decisions, right? Because without one or the other, the challenge would be it's either we take too much time or we lack decisiveness. So we need to understand the workings of each system for us to better understand how we can use these two styles of thinking to our advantage. So the first one, system one, this is our autopilot. We are able to make quick, fast decisions on the spot without putting much effort into it, right? It's based on your worldview, your mental model, your past experiences. It helps make our life easier in being able to quickly make decisions, right? System two, on the other hand, is more of the slow, the analytical part of our brain, the logical part of our brain, wherein we give time, we thoroughly think about a problem and find ways to solve it and have a solution, right? So each system works hand in hand to our advantage. Like for example, there are sometimes if you're entering a building, there's no need to give great thought in terms of how to open a door. Based on past experiences, turning a knob, pushing the door, pulling the door would open the door, right? So that's your system one's thinking. System two is more of if we're presented with an analytical problem, an algebra equation, right? We need to solve put mental effort or exert effort to it. So system one, as much as we want, to be analytical about it, put a lot of thought into it, sometimes tendency is system one makes majority of our decisions because of this mental shortcut that we want to have or quickness of making decisions, right? So to put it into an example is Daniel Kahneman has what you call the, sorry, Daniel Kahneman has what you call the bat and ball test, right? So if the bat cost $1 more than the ball, and the total is $1.10, how much will the ball cost? So I'll give you a few seconds. If you're only given a few seconds to solve this, how much does the ball cost? 3, 2, 1, go. So I'm guessing if you're 95% like most people is knee-jerk reaction would be the cost of the ball is 10 cents, right? Well, in fact, when you take out a pen and paper or pencil, you will find out that the cost of the ball is actually 5 cents, right? So you probably had an aha moment, right? So I'll walk you through the process. So for example, we apply what we know about algebra, assuming you know the basics of algebra. If x equals the bat and y equals the ball, that means x plus y, or the bat plus the ball, is equal to $1.10. So since the bat is $1 more than the ball, so x is equal to y plus $1. So substituting that equation to the x plus y, it's y plus $1 plus y equals $1.10. So adding common variables, it becomes 2y plus $1 equals $1.10. Transposing the $1, it changes to negative. 2y is equal to $1.10 minus $1, and which leaves us with 10 cents, right? So dividing both sides, finally get the answer y equals 5 cents, or the ball is equal to 5 cents. So why is this the case? If you were like 95% of the people who were asked in this study, I think this was a group of graduate students, mainly because of the simplicity of the equation. If you took it face value, our natural instinct would be to quickly resort to an answer, right? Rather than exert mental effort, mental energy in actually pulling out a pen and paper, we simply base it on face value and give out an answer, right? If you're like most people, this is your system one talking. We're in, it's our mental shortcut. We make assumptions in our mind and we give out an answer or make a decision. System two was put into the back seat, wherein, you know, if you were actually to pause a minute, take time to get out your pen and paper, have the patience to plug in the formulas to the simple algebraic equation, you'll find the right answer, right? So this is one great example to highlight how system one and system two works. Again, not one system is better over the other. We need both systems to make our lives easier. But I think the main point of this book is for us to be aware of the different heuristics, mental biases that we tend to have, so that if we're aware, sometimes we need to take a pause, take a step back, and be more objective and have more clarity in making crucial decisions, right? So there's a lot of heuristics, but for the purpose of simplicity of explaining, heuristics is basically the mental shortcut, right? Or biases that we innately have. So rather than exert effort in every decision we have to make, based on past experience, we already developed this mental shortcut in our mind. Sometimes it can be good, but if you're not aware of this, it may lead you down the wrong path. So heuristics, today I'll discuss more on the heuristics and the different mental shortcuts that I think resonated well with me and which you can apply in your day-to-day life. So the first heuristic is the affect heuristic. So this is a bias where our decisions are heavily influenced by our current state of emotion. So what does this mean? Um, Sometimes, depending on our current state, our current emotional state, our current feeling, we tend to our decisions tend to get influenced by this. It is very important to be aware of this bias rather, so that we are able to make clear decisions, be able to become objective in making decisions. So the technique that some people use is, rather than if you're too close to a problem, sometimes it's nice to step back, view the problem as if you were a third party looking in, to detach yourself from the emotions you're feeling and to be able to objectively decide what is the best solution, what is the best problem or answer to the problem at hand, right? So sometimes, for example, if you're overly ecstatic, you're super happy, tendency is you make rash decisions, right? For example, if you were to answer a survey that is totally not related to your current state, right? You tend to give a higher percentage or higher rating if you're happy versus if you are sad, depressed. So again, the affect heuristic is more on the bias depending on your current emotional state. So again, it's very important to be aware on your current emotional state so that it won't influence your decisions and you'll be able to think clearly and objectively. The second one is the anchoring heuristic. I think this is very applicable in my job, actually in any person's life. The anchoring heuristic is basically we tend to accept the first piece of information we receive. We are anchored to this information, this first piece of information, and it's very hard for us to detach from this anchor. So how is this? How is one example of this? So for example, if you are buying a house or you're looking for a place, a rental place, a condo, for example, um, if you had the price in mind that you wanted to rent, your budget is 10,000, right? And then the seller or the leaser, lessor, um, gives you a price of 30,000 pesos. Rather than counter offer with the 10,000, tendency is most people um, give a price closer to the initial price proposed by the seller or the lessor, right? So it's very applicable in sales, in negotiation. So even if you go to uh, a shop, Green Hills, for example, if you're going shopping, didn't you know the tendency of most sellers there is they jack up the price? Like for example, if you're buying a bag for if they're selling a bag for 500 pesos, well, in fact, they're willing to cut it down up until half, right? As a buyer, tendency is you get anchored to that initial price presented by the seller, and rather than be aggressive and offer or counter offer half the price, 50% off of that, tendency is you counter propose or offer a price closer to the initial price presented by the seller. So again, the main point is don't get anchored to this. It's a common sales tactic. You need to break pattern and still, counter offer which is reasonable for you. So it's good to be aware of that. The third one is primacy and recency bias rather. So tendency of most people is we tend to remember the first and the last piece of information we receive. This is very applicable because first impressions. If you noticed, first impressions and the last impressions that we get from a person really last, and they hugely impact or they hugely influence the way we feel about that certain person. So, for example, if you were in a job interview, right? Haven't you realized that you tend to be more you tend to lean towards the first few applicants who entered the door as well as the last few applicants who were in the interview? The ones in between, the middles, you tend to forget them, right? That's because of the primacy and recency bias. We tend to recall and we tend to remember the first and last impressions that we get. So even in a grocery list, we tend to remember the first few items and the last items. We tend to forget the in-betweens, right? So it's very important to be aware of this in every aspect. If you're a HR manager, if you're hiring people, be aware that, you should not be biased. You should, clearly review each and every resume. Each and every applicant's resume so that you avoid this kind of bias. So how can you apply this in other scenarios? Since first and last impressions last, it's very important for you to make a strong first impression. And towards the end, for example, you're managing a restaurant, right? Or you're a business owner. The first interaction that you get with the business customer, a potential customer, should be great, right? You need to amaze them, a great first experience. And towards the end, when they're checking out, when they're leaving your restaurant, for example, a small gesture like saying thank you, greeting them, giving a small piece of candy, uh, will pay you 1,000 folds, right? Make sure that you give a good first impression, good first interaction experience, and the last experience with you or your brand should also be great, right? And you should be good. The next bias is the availability bias. So we tend to believe things as the truth, the easier it comes to mind. So common exposure of a certain thought may cause availability bias. So for example, haven't you noticed, if you're an avid listener of the news, social media, if I were to ask you, what do you think is the more risky job in terms of your life, risking your life or your profession or your job, right? A policeman or a lumberjack? If you were like most people, you would answer that policemen have a more riskier job. And when you dig down deeper, not because of the guns and all, but because we're commonly exposed to this scenario. Like when you look at the social media feed, cop, police, kills X amount, right? Murder, etc. Even the news, you see a lot of these news articles about it, right? About policemen being involved in deaths, killings. But in fact, when you drill down the numbers, lumberjacks actually risk their job more. There's a higher risk of getting dismembered, your arm, for example, losing a limb. The risk of a lumberjack is higher versus a policeman. But because of the common exposure through social media to news channels of the risk involved in policemen or police enforcement, we tend to give emphasis, or we tend to overestimate the risks involved in the police enforcement. So again, it's because of the ease of availability. The faster it is for us to recall scenarios, situations of that specific happening, the more biased we are towards that, or we feel na there's more occurrences of that. The easier we'll be able to remember situations that involve that scenario, right? So again, it's very important to be aware of this bias and to be objective and do research, perhaps, to avoid making rash decisions based on this bias. Next is the representative heuristic. So I think this is a lot of people fall into this trap. So we are stereotyping, right? We love to stereotype a lot of people. Like if a smart student, our mental model or our mental view of a person is he or she needs to always be at the library, has glasses, never cuts class, and so on and so forth, right? And this can be applied in multiple ways. But basically, this bias is us humans, we tend to base our impressions on the likelihood of an event based on our existing view or existing worldview or mental model of that specific person, right? Again, it's very important to be aware of this and how you can use this to your advantage. Like, for example, you know, it's not always the case wherein a bad employee is the person who only goes to work um, 3 times a day, who doesn't wear corporate out attire, right? The mental model would be like that, a bad employee. Well, in fact, he may be the top performer in that company. So again, it's not, we must be aware of this stereotype wherein we need to break that mental model of how we segment people based on the stereotypes. So the main reason is why we have this representative heuristic is because it makes our life easier rather than put a lot of mental effort into it. We're able to stereotype certain people, for example, and put them into buckets for us to have to simplify our life. But again, it's not always the case, not necessarily. That's why you need to be aware of this. Next is the loss aversion. So the key nugget of wisdom here is we tend to view loss greater than the potential gain. So for example, I'm more afraid of losing um, versus me potentially gaining. Like for example, this one, lower right. Even if there's a low probability of me losing $10,000. For example, if there's a 5% chance for me to lose $10,000, but there's a 95% chance for me to gain $10,000. If you're like most people, you'd still be afraid even if there's a low probability of you losing $10,000, a 5% chance. Tendency is you don't take that risk because again, you have that fear of loss. The fear of loss outweighs the potential gain. So one example there is insurance companies. So insurance companies have built an entire multi-billion dollar business based on this heuristic or mental bias, wherein they propose to you, they sell to you, they build this mental model within you of the potential risk of you catching critical illnesses, etc., and offer you a solution, right? Overlooking that you actually pay the monthly premiums for you to prepare for the future, right? So again, banking on this fear of loss, insurance companies were able to build an entire business out of it. So to avoid this from happening, we need to weigh the entire situation, in its entirety, rather than only the potential loss, right? So how to avoid? It's by identifying the worst case scenario, and based on these worst case scenario, is this aligned to your risk appetite, risk benefit appetite? And if so, you'll be able to make a more rational decision, objective decision, right? And the lastly is the peak end bias. So I like this bias because I think a lot of us fall into this trap. We're in we tend to judge the experience largely based on its peak or the most intense moment or intense point of that experience and its end, rather than the total sum or average of each and every moment of the experience. So how is that example? So for example, if you go on a family trip to Disneyland, right? If you notice, pre-COVID, the lines were very long. Even if you spend multiple hours waiting for the line in the scorching heat of the sun. If you were to take a survey at the end of the ride, a tendency is if you enjoyed the peak moment and the end moment of the experience, you'd still give a high rating despite spending most of the time, despite having a bad experience in line or waiting in line for hours and hours. So the main explanation of this is whenever we judge or we are able to give a rating or um, give a rating, for example, we tend to base it on our most intense moment, which for the roller case example would be the point leading up to the roller coaster going up and the rush and the feeling of going down, right? So because of that experience, going down, endorphins are up, the excitement, the energy, tendency is you give a high rating, even if you spend most of the time waiting in line and so on and so forth. So there's multiple applications of this. Um, even if you were a restaurant, for example, you'd rather have a great experience in one of those seating experiences in your restaurant rather than have a platonic an okay experience in your restaurant. So again, you need to think and be creative how to give that peak moment and a great experience in that peak moment and at the end of the entire experience, because people tend to give more value in its peak and its end versus the sum or total or average of each and every part of the experience. So again, wrapping up, what are the key takeaways of the book? So system 1 and system 2, like I highlighted earlier, system 1 is our quick way, our mental model, our sometimes biased way of making decisions. System 2 is more of the slow, exerted effort part of thinking. So no system is better over the other. Each of these need to work hand in hand to make our lives easier. But again, it's more of important to be aware of each thought process so that we avoid making rash decisions and be objective in making decisions. And there were a lot of heuristics, which in other words, mental shortcuts that were highlighted in the book. The affect heuristics, wherein our feelings affect our current emotional state, hugely influences our judgment, right? The anchoring bias is we get anchored to the first piece of information that we are fed to. The primary recency bias is that we are biased towards the first and last information or the experience that we had. Availability bias is we are biased on the ease of recalling information. The more easy it is for us to recall certain situations, the more weight we are given, the more weight we give to that specific scenario. Representativeness heuristic is we are biased based on the current mental model that we have. So for example, again, like earlier, if we view a studious kid, someone who has glasses, hangs out in the library, we tend to place all people who look like that in that specific bucket. Loss aversion is we have greater emphasis with the fear of loss rather than the potential gain. So sometimes we are risk averse, especially when there are losses involved. Even if we know that we're gonna gain a lot, we tend to revert back to taking the safer option. Peak end bias is we remember its peak, the most intense point, and the ending of the experience rather than the individual parts or the sum of the individual parts. So whenever creating a customer experience, think about how can you create that great intense or that great peak moment and have a great ending experience to have a great to enhance the customer experience journey, right? So again, those are the key takeaways from the book. Short and sweet. There's a lot of learnings in the book, but these are the my key takeaways from the book and how you can apply it. So hopefully you apply it. I think it can help, not just if you're in a sales role, but in your day to day. If you like my content, again, please like and subscribe my YouTube channel, and you can also follow me on LinkedIn, Paulo Balinas. And with that, that ends my book summary number 2. The next book I'm reading is 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And stay tuned for next week. So thank you and have a great day. Like and subscribe YouTube. Thank you and